Chapter 086. A New World. Good morning, brother. Kiriel screamed, her voice disgustedly shrill and cheerful. Morning, morning, morning. Zorian sighed, stretching his arms and legs while Kiriel babbled on top of him. Another restart, another annoying wake-up call from Kiriel. He gave his little sister a silent, complex look, which caused her to hesitate for a second and ask him what's wrong. Zorian didn't answer. Instead, he suddenly started shaking like a madman, taking advantage of that brief moment of indecision when she loosened her grip on him to push her off to the side. She fell on the floor with a soft thud and an indignant yell. She was back on her feet in a flash, though, annoying him with questions about the academy and requests to show her some magic. In other words, she was still the same old Kiriel he had come to know over the restarts. He had thought about including her among the many people who gotten a temporary marker in the previous restart, but in the end he had decided bringing her into the time loop would be reckless and cruel. Unlike the others, Kiriel was just a child. Her personality had yet to fully form, and there was no telling how being stuck in a constantly repeating month would warp her thinking. She also couldn't keep a secret to save her life and had no way to really contribute to their projects. Not to mention that if he failed to find the way to extend the temporary markers before the 6th restart was up, he would have to watch her forget 6 months' worth of memories. That would be a hard pill to swallow. No, the idea was definitely off limits. While he would have appreciated a chance to have more meaningful interaction with Kiriel, it wasn't worth inflicting existential dread on a 9-year-old and dragging down everyone's chances of survival just for that. After a few minutes, he finally coaxed Kiriel into leaving the room. He promptly locked the door and created a single simulacrum. It was a simple ectoplasmic copy. This early in the restart, he had neither the time nor the materials to create the golem bodies necessary for the improved mechanical simulacrums he usually liked to use. However, accessibility was more important than mana efficiency in this case. He needed the simulacrum now and not later. The moment it popped into existence, the simulacrum gave him a silent nod and then teleported away. There was no need to explain anything. The simulacrum had a simple task, planned out all the way in the previous restart and now simply put into practice. His copy was to go to Cyoria and immediately hunt down and dismantle all 4 cephalic rat swarms lurking in the city. It would doubtlessly alarm Quatakikl if he did that, but it had to be done. With all these new time loopers walking around, the swarms were too much of a threat. They needed them gone, and the sooner it was done, the better. After dispatching the simulacrum to his task, Zorian went down into the kitchen to eat something while waiting for Ilsa to arrive. He couldn't help but be a little nervous. While Ilsa's visit at the beginning of the restart had long since become repetitive and routine, meeting his invocations teacher should be different this time around. She was, after all, one of the people they placed a temporary marker on. If everything went well, she had retained her memories of the previous restart. He shook his head, trying to collect his thoughts. He was kind of annoyed at himself for being so emotional over this. Previously, when he and Zack were considering going down this road, he had imagined himself facing this scenario with a stoic attitude and cool assurance born out of years of experiences and conflicts in the time loop. But reality was cruel and his nerves were not as steely as he imagined them to be. Would the temporary markers work as advertised? Would they work at all? Would Ilsa be able to take first-hand experience of the time loop in good grace, or would she flip out and start flinging spells at him, demanding answers? He couldn't help but worry about questions such as this as minutes ticked by. What was taking her so long anyway? He wasn't sure, but he thought it didn't usually take this much time before she... There was a knock at the door. "I'll get it," said Zorian quickly, rushing for the door. Mother looked amused at this kind of reaction, but said nothing as he ran past her. He opened the door and found Ilsa standing there. She looked no different than she usually did at the beginning of the restart. The same clothes, the same judging look, the same stack of documents held in her hands. However, that was only outward appearance. To his empathic senses, she was practically radiating uncertainty and apprehension. They stared at each other in silence for a while. "May I come in?" Ilsa eventually asked. Oh," said Zorian with a small laugh, wincing inwardly at his behavior. "I guess I spaced out a little. Forgive my manners, Miss Zalady. Come in, please." "Thank you, Mr. Kaczynski," she said, stepping into the house. Although his momentary brain freeze wasn't the most flattering way to start a meeting like this, it seemed to have put Ilsa at ease somewhat, as he felt a lot of the tension drain out of her in the aftermath. Like usual, Mother immediately left the house when she realized who had come, taking Kiriel with her. This left Zorian alone with Ilsa to ostensibly discuss his electives and whatnot. But well, same as the last time, I suppose? Ilsa asked, waving the academy documents in front of her. When Zorian answered yes, she simply threw the stack to the side and sighed. Of course. You probably heard this all 100 times by now. I don't even know why I brought these along with me. Clinging to a sense of normalcy in light of a very bizarre situation, Zorian guessed. I was the same back when I was first dragged into the time loop. I spent quite a few loops going through the motions. You were a teenager who barely started learning magic, though. I am an experienced adult mage. I should be better than this, Ilsa countered, frowning slightly. She was silent for a few seconds, tapping her fingers against the table as she considered what to say next. So this is real. We really traveled back in time. It's a little more complex than that, but yes, Zorian said. He didn't want to get bogged down in details of how the time loop actually worked. Did the marker we gave you work? Obviously, she scoffed. How would we be having this conversation otherwise? What I meant was, did you completely retain your magic and memories? Zorian clarified. Any holes in your recollection or difficulty in doing magic? That's a possibility? She asked, surprised. It might be. As I said in the previous restart, this is the first time we have done something like this, Zorian said. She gave it a thought for a minute before shaking her head. I don't feel there are any obvious blanks in my memories, she said. I did forget quite a few things, but I think that's just me being forgetful as usual. My memory is hardly flawless. As for magic, well, I'm a grown mage that has reached most of her potential years ago, and a month is not that long of a time. Plus, it wasn't like I did any real training sessions in the span of this month. In other words, any growth in shaping skills you may have experienced is so minuscule that you wouldn't even notice if it was gone, Zorian surmised. Yes, that, Ilsa nodded. I guess I can learn a new spell or two this time just to see if I retain them the next time the world resets. I can probably just ask Kale. The effect of even 1 month on his shaping skills and spell knowledge should be dramatic enough to tell, pointed out Zorian. I suppose that's true, said Ilsa. Plus, now that I think about it, I'm probably going to improve my shaping skills and learn quite a few new spells just by helping you out over time. Though you never did really explain what you wanted our help with. Yes, we did not explain our plans and reasons too deeply in the previous restart, admitted Zorian. Partly because we didn't want to overwhelm people with information, but also because we suspected you would only take us seriously after you witnessed the time loop with your own 2 eyes. Huh. Well, you're probably right about that, Ilsa laughed. Svim tried to explain how the time loop worked when he was trying to convince me to accept a mysterious soul marker from my 2 teenage students. I confess I didn't pay too much attention to it since the whole idea was so crazy. I'd have probably been even less interested in what you and Zach had to say. Well, at least she was honest. Do you want me to explain now? Zorian asked. No, she said immediately. I don't think I could pay attention well enough at the moment. I'm still rather disturbed at reliving the same month all over again. You said this has been happening for a while now. Yes. The time loop has repeated itself many times, Zorian said. This is just your first time remembering it. So, before this I was just obliviously reliving the same month over and over again. Repeated the jobs, taught the same classes and spoke the same conversations. Well, sometimes me and Zach shook things up a bit and you reacted accordingly, reacting to the changes, Zorian said. But yes, without a marker, people do not retain continuity across restarts. I tried to talk to some of the people around me before coming here, Ilsa admitted, just to check if they really don't remember anything. I couldn't resist. I don't think I revealed anything crucial, but I feel it's only fair to let you know. Zorian sighed. He suspected she wasn't the only one to make such discreet tests, and that there would be more of that stuff to deal with later. But that was okay. They kind of expected that. I understand the need for confirmation, but please try to be responsible about this, he said. It would be a disaster if the knowledge of the time loop reached certain people. And now I'm being lectured by one of my teenage students, Ilsa said, clacking her tongue. How low the mighty have fallen. But fair enough, I do understand we have a mighty millennia-old lich breathing down our necks. Your fight against him has left quite an impression on me, I must say. Zorian just made a slightly sour expression in response. Unsurprisingly, Quatakikal had taken great offense at them trying to look through his memories and stealing his crown. While Zack and Zorian were placing temporary markers on people, Quatakikal was burning down the Novita estate and Amaya's house as the first step of his revenge. Fortunately, all inhabitants of Amaya's place had been evacuated to Koth by that point, and Zack couldn't care less about the Novita estate. The ancient lich remained quiet after that, probably because he couldn't find them and still had an invasion to execute. Then Zack and Zorian had the bright idea to bring the new loopers to Cyoria on invasion day, to show them how high the stakes really were. Despite being under a plethora of powerful divination wards and constantly moving, Quatakikal somehow noticed them. The resulting fight completely leveled the street they were fighting in. Though Quatakikal is a huge danger, I'm pretty sure the Eldamarian government, the Triumvirate Church, powerful noble houses and other powers would also make problems for us if they knew, Zorian said. So please be careful. They spent the next half an hour discussing various things. The mechanics of the time loop, the way things usually developed if Zack and Zorian did not interfere with things, and the details behind the Abasan invasion. Ilsa turned out to be just as interested in the invasion of Cyoria as she was in the time loop itself. Then again, that was probably not too unusual. They brought people to witness the attack for a reason. You don't seem to care much for the suffering and devastation we witnessed, Ilsa eventually said, a note of condemnation in her voice. I'm just a little numb to it all, that's all. I've seen it happen too many times, sometimes from the memories of the invaders themselves, Zorian said. It's impossible for me to have the same visceral reaction to it that you probably have. You read their memories? She asked, surprised. I had to, he simply said. Of course you've dabbled in mind magic too, she said in a strange tone. Dabbled? Zorian huffed. This annoys me more than it probably should. I did not dabble in it. I'm a natural mind mage who spent years honing his skills. She seemed to be at a loss for words upon hearing that. This situation is endlessly bizarre and disturbing, she finally said after a few seconds. Agreed, Zorian nodded. I've been stuck in this time loop for nearly 8 years, not counting all the time dilation chambers, and I still think that. Time dilation chambers? Ilsa asked. She suddenly shook her head. No, never mind that for now. 8 years is actually not as long as I thought it would be. I got included rather late into this thing, Zorian said. Zack is the one who has spent decades inside the time loop. Ugh. Every answer gives me 5 new questions, Ilsa complained. You know what? Let's stop this for now. You are planning to take the train to Cyoria, right? Yes, I'm taking Kiriel with me, so I need to pretend I'm somewhat normal. Of course, if you are willing to teleport us to Cyoria yourself. No, she said immediately. I'm taking a train ride with you instead. Zorian was taken aback at the proclamation. He knew that things would be very much different now that other loopers were walking around, but he couldn't help but get blindsided by things like this. Why? Zorian asked uncertainly. You might be used to it, but I've just watched the city get brutally invaded by hordes of monsters and undead, she told him. I'd like to stay away from Cyoria for a while, and this is a convenient excuse. Oh, he said lamely. Come to think of it, it had only been a few hours at most since the invasion, at least from her perspective. You don't mind, do you? She asked him. Not at all, he said, shaking his head. Just watch out for Kiriel if you plan to ride in the same compartment as us. She has an intense interest in magic and anything related to it, and she's probably going to find you absolutely fascinating. I don't see a problem with that, Ilsa smiled. It's nice to see kids interested in my work. Zorian didn't bother to clarify things. Some things were better as a surprise. Break. Mother did not look very surprised when Ilsa informed her she would be accompanying them to the train station. It probably seemed entirely sensible to her that Ilsa would use a train to get back to Cyoria. The two of them got along pretty well with one another, and were soon happily chatting along as they waited on the station for the train to arrive. Zorian mostly ignored the conversation as it sounded like your typical parent-teacher discussion. Kiriel was too excited about going to Cyoria to care about the teacher that had decided to stick around for a while longer, but Fortov did feel the need to approach the group and say hi after seeing Ilsa present. That was a little new. You didn't include Fortov among those who received the marker, Ilsa observed quietly. No, Zorian whispered back. He's useless and I don't like him. Ilse had nothing to say in response to that, just giving him a guarded look in return. Maybe he really was a little harsh towards Fortov. Still, he honestly couldn't see any good reason to give the guy a temporary marker. Fortov was unreliable and had no work ethic, so including him in the time loop would be about as wise as including Kiriel. Eventually they boarded the train and set off towards Syoria. Kiriel became more wary of Ilse when she realized the teacher was going to stay in the same compartment as them, but, well, it was Kiriel. Patience was never her strong suit. She barely lasted half an hour before she started bombarding Ilse with questions. Ilse was a patient woman, but after an hour and a half of Kiriel's chattiness, Zorian could feel she was starting to get rather exasperated with the whole situation. Thus, he decided to have mercy on her and distracted his little sister with a bunch of visually impressive illusions and stories. Ilse observed the illusionary scenes he conjured up with a surprising amount of interest. Try as he might, he just couldn't figure out what she found so fascinating about those. Weren't they just illusions? She was a mage at the continent's best magical academy. Surely she had seen plenty of those in her life. Eventually he decided to ask her. Since he didn't want Kiriel to listen in on them, he established a mental link to her and spoke to her telepathically. She was badly startled at first, flinching at the sudden voice in her head, but she recovered quickly. Her response was swift and smooth, with no unintentional thoughts leaking through. It was clear that she had experience with this kind of communication. You can ignore the shaping disruption of the train wards, Ilse telepathically sent back through the link. I mean, of course you can. For someone like you, doing that is a minor thing. I could do it too. However, casting such sophisticated illusions while being suppressed by the wards, that takes considerable skill. Did you say you were trying to pretend you are somewhat normal? How is this even remotely normal? Well, it's not like Kiriel can really tell how amazing this is, he sent back lamely. Truthfully, neither could he until this point. He learned these illusions pretty much solely to entertain Kiriel. They were just little tricks to him, and so was the ability to bypass the laughable disruption wards on the train. It completely slipped his mind that someone like Ilse could figure out exactly what he was doing and how difficult it was and find it notable. So, Ilse sent. You are good enough at combat magic to fight a 1,000-year-old lich. You are a mind mage and an illusionist. You can teleport around with ease and open dimensional gates. You can create duplicates of yourself. You are an expert golem maker with all that implies. You say you achieved all of that in what, 8 years? Pretty much, yeah. Zorian confirmed. Forgive me for being blunt here, Mr. Kaczynski, but aren't you a fairly average mage? Ilse asked curiously. I never got an impression that you are some amazingly talented person from the information I was given. And trust me, people had looked into it. Whenever a world-class talent like Daimen appears, their family is always investigated in case their boons run in the blood. Aside from being an innate mind mage, I am indeed pretty average, Zorian said calmly. Ilse's comment might have infuriated him once, but these days he no longer cared. I know what you're thinking, and yes, my rapid growth as a mage is all due to the time loop. Doesn't just give time, you know. It's also given me nigh limitless resources, access to restricted materials, and plenty of normally unobtainable experience. It's also put me under enormous pressure, keeping me constantly motivated in a way I otherwise wouldn't be. I honestly think anyone could do what I did if put in the same position. Well, provided they didn't just break under the pressure. Ilse stayed quiet for a while, but Zorian could practically feel the gears turning in her head. She was probably realizing for the first time the sort of amazing opportunity the time loop represented. I think I'm getting just a tiny bit jealous of you, Mr. Kaczynski, Ilse eventually concluded. Don't envy me just yet, he told her. There is still a good chance that I will get erased in the end and everything I have worked for will be for naught. What? She asked, startled. What do you mean? With that, he started explaining the situation in detail to her. He told her about Red Robe, the uncertainty about whether they could even get out of the time loop, the problems he had to solve to survive the exit, and so on. It took a while to go through everything. Strangely enough, Ilse looked calmer and more reassured by the end, even though he had just told her there was a big chance they would all lose everything at the end. Then again, maybe it wasn't so strange. She already knew that temporary markers like her own only lasted 6 months. Compared to that, a more distant deadline that would also destroy Zack and Zorian probably didn't seem so intimidating. On the contrary, she may have found it reassuring that they also had the same fate waiting for them if they failed. I was wondering why you decided to include so many people in this time loop instead of just monopolizing the whole thing for yourself and Zack. Your situation is quite desperate, she said, humming to herself audibly enough for Kiriel to hear her and give her funny looks. You don't have to sound so happy about it, Zorian groused. But yes, we really do need your help badly. Ilsa was mostly included because of her connections. Though she acted a bit low-key most of the time, she knew many people and was owed quite a few favors. Hopefully she could help them convince people to go along with whatever crazy plans they came up with and smooth any ruffled feathers they caused along the way. Considering how few other members of their little conspiracy were diplomatically inclined or familiar with bureaucratic wrangling, this was a valuable skill. Plus, she was a powerful alteration expert. Zorian wasn't sure, but he felt she might be able to help him produce his golems faster. She couldn't animate them, of course, but he was currently producing such a large number of them every restart that it took a while to simply create enough mechanical bodies for animation. If Ilsa was as good at alteration and material alchemy as Svim claimed, she should be able to take over that part of the production process and free Zorian to do other things. Why not just hire someone to do that for you? Ilsa asked when he told her that. I hear from Svim you've been doing that a lot already. I can't. Zorian shook his head. Anyone I contract will surely figure out what I intend to do with such a sophisticated metal doll, and making combat-capable golems is forbidden without a license. Makes sense, Ilsa said. You don't want to have random mages building themselves a private army of golems in their free time. Exactly, Zorian said. I might be able to coax a person to build me a single puppet, but if I order a batch of 20 puppets they'll freak out. Nobody wants to get implicated in an attempted rebellion or whatever. I'd be lucky if they didn't immediately report me to the government when they throw me out of the shop. Ilsa nodded. After some thought she changed the subject. You know, all this talk about golems and alteration is reminding me of something I thought of when you were explaining how the time loop works. Destroying the entire world and then recreating it out of nothing. It reminds me of a persistent ambition of mine. Oh, you mean true creation? Zorian guessed. You know about it? Ilsa was surprised. I don't remember talking about it around you. I suppose one of my previous incarnations told you about it. Yeah, Zorian confirmed. I sought you out quite often in the beginning to learn from you. You taught me much of what I know right now, or at least gave me a push in the right direction. We'll have to talk about that more on some other occasion, Ilsa said with a smile. It looks like you owe me and I don't even know about it. How am I supposed to know to seek you out for favors if I don't even know that I have leverage over you? But anyway, true creation. Yes, in a way the time loop is the ultimate expression of that desire of mine. A magic that creates an entire world over and over again. Are you sure you have no idea how it is done? No, sorry, Zorian said apologetically. That power is absolutely godlike in scope and mystery. Or rather, primordial, since the Sovereign Gate seems to be made out of one of those. Considering the stories of mortal mages doing it in the past, and in light of the fact that there is a device that can repeatedly create an entire world, I am convinced it is easier than most people suspect. Maybe I'll be able to figure something out by observing this constantly recreated world I'm in, Ilsa said wistfully. Maybe, Zorian said doubtfully. He doubted she would really get anywhere with that, but he wouldn't stop her. Eventually, Kiriel dozed off and the telepathic conversation died down a little, leaving both Zorian and Ilsa lost in their own thoughts. The train continued its routine journey to Cyoria. Break. When Zorian, Kiriel and Ilsa arrived in Cyoria and disembarked, they found there were people already waiting for them. Zack being there was kind of expected, but he was also accompanied by Svim, Kiran and Taven. Most people did not react to this, of course, but Kiriel knew damn well that there was something fishy about that and kept giving everyone weird glances and got really quiet for a time. Zorian also noticed Fortov staring at him weirdly in the distance. He wasn't sure how much his brother really knew about him, but he was probably aware that Zorian hadn't had any real friends until recently, so having a bunch of people wait for him at the train station was beyond unusual. He did not make any move or approach though, since nobody was attacking anyone and Zorian didn't look like he needed help. After dropping off Kiriel at Amaya's place, the group found a secluded location and started talking. Kiran, their combat magic instructor, was included into the group due to his high combat skills and the fact he had connections to people in Eldamar's military. He was the first to speak up. These temporary markers you placed on us to retain our memories, can they be revoked? Kiran asked. Of course, the first thing they wanted to discuss was the markers. Zorian didn't blame them. He knew he would have been the same if he were in their place. He was kind of mystified why they hadn't just asked Zack about that while they were waiting instead of saving it until now, but maybe they had talked about other things such as how the time loop worked. Or maybe they had just gathered together quite recently and hadn't had the time to discuss anything. He knew that Zack hated waiting and had a habit of showing up late, so he probably hadn't been at the train station for long. Yes, Zorian told him bluntly. At will? Kieran asked next. Well, we need the crown that is currently in Quatakikle's possession to do it, Zorian said carefully. So not really, no. Also, removing the marker only prevents you from keeping your magic and memories when the world resets next, Zack said. It doesn't wipe away what you achieved until that point. Can the marker be reapplied once it runs out or is revoked? Svim asked. I know what you're thinking, Zack sighed. Sadly, it's not that easy. Yes, you can place a marker on the same person the second time, but only after 12 restarts have passed. You can't just remove the marker and then reapply it to extend the time. I imagined it was something like that, Svim admitted. Zorian suddenly yelped in pain. After looking around, he realized Taven had pinched his arm for no discernible reason. Why did you do that? He protested. I wanted to make sure your arm is really fine, she said, frowning. Zorian suddenly realized this was the same arm that ended up getting cut off by Quatakikle in the previous restart. He had pretty much been a cripple the last time that she had seen him. Still, how the hell was it okay for her to just pinch him like that? Huffing with indignation, Zorian stepped away from Taven and maneuvered himself to place Ilsa between the two of them. Ilsa gave him an amused look in response. So what's the plan? Kieran said. We are hoping we can figure out a way to adjust the temporary markers into lasting indefinitely, Zorian said. Admittedly, tampering with a piece of magic that probably had gods involved in its construction sounds hopeless. But we suspect that Red Robe entered the time loop through this very method. If so, it should be possible for us to do it as well. Right, if Red Robe could have done it, surely all of us working together should be able to work something up, Zack said. And if you fail? Svim insisted. We will hopefully gather the entire key before all 6 restarts run out, at which point we will be able to unblock the exit, Zorian said. If we have an exit method also ready by then, we might be able to just get you out of the time loop at that point. At which point it doesn't really matter that your marker will run out. And what, you're just going to continue in the time loop alone afterwards? Taven asked. Or are you just going to create new temporary loopers once we're gone? And then get them out too? I don't know about the rest, but I think the world doesn't need 3 different Tavens. Actually, we would just exit the time loop with you, Zack said. We already got almost everything we could wish for out of the time loop. No need to risk everything by being greedy and cutting things close. If we can leave 6 months from now, we will. Silence greeted this proclamation. Zorian knew that the new loopers were worried about their motives, afraid that he and Zack were trying to make use of them as much as possible before discarding them. Not an unreasonable fear. Temporary markers were pretty much designed with that in mind. Presumably the controller would place these on people without ever informing them of the time limit, allowing them to reap all the benefits of having a person work with them for 6 months and then conveniently forgetting everything. However, Zack and Zorian did not intend to use the temporary markers just to get a convenient workforce. They got them into the mess and they would do their best to get them out of it. Maybe they would fail in the end, but it wouldn't be for the lack of trying. Well, Svim eventually said, breaking the silence. We'd best get to work then. Break. Days passed and the effects of the many new loopers rapidly became evident. Kale arrived in Cyoria earlier, barely a day after Zorian did. Lukhav and Alanik did not need to be saved from Sidamir's machinations. Taven no longer bothered hunting monsters with her team. Ilsa's classes were completely different, since she decided she would shake things up a bit. The cephalic rats had been completely wiped out by Zorian's simulacrum on the very first day of the restart, with the exception of a handful of individuals the simulacrum had saved up for study. Their usual routine of convincing Svim, Alanik and Silverlake that the time loop was real became unnecessary, freeing up a surprisingly substantial amount of time. Finally, not having to gain the trust of the Silent Doorway adepts before they could use their ability to operate the Bakura Gate network meant they could access distant places from the very start of the restart. Thus, once Zack and Zorian had sorted out the situation in Cyoria for a bit, they used a Bakura Gate to reach Koth so they could pick up the Imperial Orb, and maybe get themselves a pet hydra. Before they did that, though, they decided to visit the Terramachula estate to see if everything was fine there. Daimen had assured them that the people he had picked were reliable, but Zorian knew better than anyone that Daimen said a lot of things. When they arrived, they found the whole estate to be a hive of activity, people constantly coming and going, and there were people already waiting for them. There was no need to justify themselves or try to get them to admit Daimen was present like they usually did the first time they contacted them in the restart. Still, while not having to wait at the door was convenient, what came later was not. Just like the new loopers back in Cyoria, the new loopers in Koth also wanted their questions answered, and what was supposed to be just a short checkup ended up being a grueling question and answer session that lasted for most of the day. I really hope this is a one-time thing, Zorian groused later to Daimen. You were supposed to explain these sort of things to them, Daimen. I did. Daimen protested. They just wanted to hear things from you, I guess. Can you blame them? I guess not, Zorian said. If Daimen had explained things fairly, then these people must surely know it wasn't Daimen who was really in charge. It made sense that they wanted to talk to the people who are the source of the temporary markers and have first-hand information. Anyway, did you get your team ready? Will the Terramachula really cooperate when you inform them you want to send their best trackers all the way to Blantyre all of a sudden? This was the main reason he and Zack wanted Daimen's cooperation, and why they allowed him to include so many people into the marked group. To put it bluntly, they needed these people to find the staff. They had managed to track down a Bakura gate on Blantyre in the previous restart, thanks to the help from that Lizardman King, but that was just the first step. The next was to track down a tiny little staff on a giant jungle-covered continent. To put it bluntly, this was something that he and Zack alone were utterly incapable of doing. Zorian would never say this out loud to Daimen, but he and his group were probably the most critical people to receive the temporary markers. Without them, they would probably never find the staff. This was one of the primary reasons they decided to go down this path to begin with. My team will listen to me even if I tell them we're going to Blantyre through a dimensional gate opened up by my little brother, Daimen said proudly. Hell, they'd probably go along with it even if I alone received the marker, but they would complain more. With Torin, Kerma and other critical members of the team also on board, though, everyone will readily fall in line. As for the Terramachula, well, I'm not sure what level of support we can get out of them, but we will definitely get something. The main problem is that we're being a bit unreasonable and pushing for full commitment to this project without the idea being even hinted at before now. That's not how House Terramachula usually does things, to say the least, so some tension and incredulity are to be expected. Will it help if I give you money and resources to throw at them? Zorian asked. I know House Terramachula is not poor, but I'm pretty sure me and Zack could gather enough money to finance a small state if we really try. Not to mention a large amount of priceless materials that cannot be bought on the open market. Daimen looked at him with a strange mixture of horror and joy, his face alternating between various unusual grimaces. I hate you, he finally said. You better plan to gift some of that money to your poor older brother when we get out. Aren't you pretty well off? Zorian asked, arching his eyebrow at him. You're even marrying into nobility. You can never have enough money, Daimen said. Never. And yes, please do send all that money here if you can. Trying to flat-out bribe the Terramachula directly with it wouldn't go well, but I'm sure they would look more favorably on the plan if we agreed to pay for all the equipment and mercenaries out of our own pockets. And some completely unrelated gifts would probably be appreciated. Zorian nodded and made a mental note to mention the matter to Zack. And speaking of Zack, his fellow time traveler, well, one of his fellow time travelers now was already waiting for them at the front gate, humming to himself happily. Zorian didn't have to ask to know what the other boy was thinking of at the moment. Say, Zorian asked Daimen, do you know what the legality of owning a giant, magically enhanced Hydra is in Eldamar? Just asking for a friend. Chapter 087. Agents of the Crown. Deep in the jungles of Koth, in what was otherwise an unremarkable patch of rainforest, a situation was unfolding. The trees shook, the animals vacated the area in panic, and the underbrush was trampled underfoot as a gigantic, furious hydra thundered through the area in pursuit of its target. Its 8 heads fanned out and snapped angrily towards anything in the vicinity that failed to get out of its way, breaking low-hanging branches and killing any animal that was too slow to flee. As for Zorian, who was its target, he simply kept running and dodging while marveling at the incredible speed with which the Hydra was able to move through the thick vegetation of the rainforest. He had thought its size would make maneuvering difficult and allow him to easily keep ahead of it, but he had seriously underestimated its ability to just plow through everything in front of it without stopping. He was purposely running through the most difficult terrain he could find, and he never even came close to losing it. It was constantly trailing just behind him. A blue, translucent ectoplasmic eye constantly trailed after Zorian, hovering above his head and staring at the Hydra. It was through this eye that Zorian was able to keep track of the Hydra's movements and dodge its attacks, despite having his back turned to it. Otherwise, if he were forced to run blind or had to periodically slow down to turn around, the Hydra would have grabbed him 100 times by now. Though the spell itself was very simple, very few people would be able to process information from two different perspectives like that. The fact Zorian could look both in front of him and behind him at the same time, while maneuvering through a treacherous, obstacle-filled jungle floor, was proof that his experiments with mental enhancement were bearing some fruit. The chase led them next to a fallen, rotting log covered in moss and mushrooms. Without its main body slowing down at all, one of the Hydra's 8 heads reached down and bit into it, lifting it out of the ground and launching it at Zorian. Half a dozen monstrous centipedes and one very terrified squirrel tumbled out of the rotting log as it sailed through the air, having hidden in it when they noticed the rampaging Hydra approaching. Zorian reacted instantly, making a few silent movements and causing a bright red ectoplasmic hand to materialize in the air behind him and slap the log aside. It collided with the nearby tree, where it exploded into a shower of rotting wood. Both Zorian and the Hydra simply charged through the cloud of wooden shrapnel, one with the aid of magical shields and the other through the power of supernatural toughness and regeneration. "Zack, what the hell are you doing there?" Zorian yelled. "I've been running for ages here. Did you figure out the dagger or not?" Zack, who was trailing behind both of them while occasionally making funny poses and waving the dagger in his hand at the Hydra, seemed to pause at the question. "It's hard, okay," he yelled back. "I'm running low on mana here," Zorian said. "If you don't figure it out soon, I'm calling this off." In truth, the Hydra posed very little threat to Zorian. If the situation ever got too dangerous, he could have always teleported away or simply flown away too high for the Hydra to reach. However, that would leave it free to turn around and shift its attention to Zack, which would defeat the whole purpose of this setup. The point of him leading the Hydra on the merry chase through the Gothic jungle was to give Zack the time he needed to figure out how to use the dagger on the Hydra. Something that didn't seem to be going too well. Well, on the bright side, if Zack couldn't figure it out by the time Zorian ran out of mana, it would be Zorian's turn next. Zorian would actually prefer if he was the one who figured out how to use the dagger, since he and Zack had agreed that whoever succeeded at this would get to own the Hydra. He had a good feeling about his chances since, unlike Zack, he had soul perception unlocked. Surely that would... "Hydra!" Zack suddenly shouted, dramatically pointing the dagger in the monster's direction. "I am your master now. Kneel before me." No less than 3 of the Hydra's head glanced towards Zack, giving him a hateful, contemptuous look before returning their attention to Zorian again. Before Zorian could say anything, Zack suddenly teleported right on top of the Hydra and plunged the dagger straight into its back. Zorian wanted to scream at his fellow time traveler for being such an idiot. Not only had Zack exposed himself to incredible danger, since the Hydra's heads could twist backwards to reach people foolish enough to climb on its back with incredible speed and ease, the boy had also invalidated all the effort Zorian invested into making sure the Hydra was focused on him and him alone. Even if Zack got away from this stunt completely unscathed, and he probably would, in all honesty, the Hydra would no longer ignore him from this point onward. Indeed, the moment Zack popped into existence on top of the Hydra's back, before he even finished plunging the dagger into its flesh, the monster was already stopping its charge, all 8 of its heads refocusing on this sudden new threat. However, the moment the dagger sank into its back, a strange thing happened. Instead of simply ignoring the puny wound and biting down on Zack anyway, the Hydra suddenly stiffened as if paralyzed. Its many heads froze in the air, jaws still stretched wide for a lethal bite, staring at Zack with confused, uncomprehending eyes. "No way," Zorian complained weakly. "Ha ha." Zack laughed, wrenching the dagger out of the wound and quickly straightening himself up. The Hydra's back not being the most stable of grounds, he almost lost his balance upon doing that and had to spend several seconds to stabilize himself. The Hydra remained completely motionless throughout all of that. Zack slapped the closest Hydra head a few times playfully. "What did I tell you, I really am your master now. Kneel. The command seemed to break the Hydra out of its paralysis. Without hesitation it dropped to the ground. Being a quadrupedal life form, it couldn't really exactly kneel as such, so it instead just dropped on its stomach and lowered its many heads on the ground. The sudden motion completely unbalanced Zack, however, sending him tumbling down the creature's back with a strangled cry. He hit the ground with a dull thud, landing on one of the exposed rocks, and then spent the next minute and a half rolling around in pain on the ground. Zorian eyed the Hydra for a few seconds before deciding not to approach for now. It was no longer attacking him, but he had a feeling that might change if he made any moves towards its new master. There is no way that was the correct command phrase to activate the dagger, is it? He eventually asked. Ugh. Damn, this hurt, said Zack, laboriously rising to his feet while using the nearby Hydra as a stabilizer. He did his best to dust himself off and get rid of the branches and bugs stuck in his hair. And no, that wasn't the command phrase. The way to activate the dagger is to first cut yourself with it to establish resonance and then cut the Hydra to forge a bond with it and finalize the deal. Zorian gave him a curious look. How the hell did you figure that out? I accidentally cut myself with it while trying to mess around with it while running, Zack admitted with an awkward laugh. He turned towards the Hydra, whose many eyes diligently followed his every move. Anyway, who cares about that? It doesn't matter how I discovered the dagger's usage. All that matters is that the Hydra is finally mine. Well, ours, but you know. Yeah, I know, Zorian said, clacking his tongue. He'd normally be annoyed about losing a bet like that, but it was probably better this way. There was no guarantee he would have uncovered such a curious method of activation himself. He felt the Hydra's mind a little. He kind of expected to find the Hydra resentful of being effectively enslaved like this, but he found the creature to be mostly curious instead. Confused and a little scared too, but mostly just curious. It did not seem to harbor any ill will towards Zack. Zorian had never heard of a monster control method that was that thorough and effective, and the Hydra should be highly resistant to mind control due to its unique mind anyway. He had a feeling this was more than just control. In some strange way, the Hydra was conditioned to regard the bond forged by the dagger as innately legitimate and did not struggle against its bindings at all. Zorian was torn between being impressed by the maker of the dagger for pulling it off and disturbed that such a thing was possible. In any case, the friendliness was only towards Zack. The moment Zorian tried to step closer, the Hydra immediately jumped to its feet and interposed itself between Zorian and its master, hissing and snapping its jaws at him menacingly. Oh, come on, Zorian complained. That guy doesn't need your protection from me. If anything, I would need to be protected against him if we seriously fought. The Hydra didn't understand human speech and probably wouldn't have listened to him even if it did. It was about to lunge at Zorian when Zack placed his hand on its flank and stopped it. Hey, knock it off, Zack said. That guy is our friend, okay? No eating friends. It took a few gestures and shouting before the Hydra managed to understand what its new owner was telling it, at which point it gave Zack something reminiscent of an incredulous look, as if unable to believe Zack would be friendly to someone like Zorian, who had led it on a wild goose chase for a better part of an hour. I know, he can be very annoying, but he's very useful and mostly means well, Zack said sagely, patting the Hydra gently on the flank. The Hydra directed one last unhappy hiss in Zorian's direction before grudgingly standing down and indicating it would allow him to get close without attacking him. Possibly. Zorian folded his hands over his chest and gave Zack an unamused look. Don't worry, I'm sure she'll warm up to you in time, Zack told him, grinning widely. Princess is just a little shy. What? What? Zorian blurted out. It's a she, Zack said, nodding sagely. I know, I was a little surprised myself when I felt that through the link and... No, not that. Zorian snapped. You're seriously naming a Hydra princess? Why not? Zack challenged. What's wrong with that name? The newly named princess focused 3 of her heads on him, as if daring him to say anything. Stupid reptile. It didn't even understand what they were talking about but felt the need to side with Zack anyway. It's a stupid name, Zorian told him bluntly. It's a great name, Zack disagreed. A royal name for a very royal girl. She's a divinely empowered guardian of an imperial item. That's pretty high-ranked if you ask me. Plus, you know how royals like to refer to themselves in plural. We this and we that. Well, Princess here can talk about herself in plural and be completely factual. So there. It's actually very clever and you were just too judgmental to figure it out. Ugh, Zorian grunted. If that's your logic, why not call her Queen instead? Because Princess is a more ironic name for a giant hydra, Zack admitted. Zorian spent the next 15 minutes trying to argue the issue before giving up. It took another hour after that to coax Princess back into the Imperial Orb for transport. She wanted to follow around after Zack like a puppy, and was confused why he wanted to abandon her in the orb so soon after their bonding. Zorian had to say watching Zack awkwardly try to convince a clingy hydra that he would be back and that she should stay put was kind of amusing. Perhaps it was a good thing that Zack ended up winning that bet after all. After recovering the Imperial Orb and tentatively subduing the hydra guarding it, Zack and Zorian turned their attention towards the Sol Rotham at the Ziggurat of the Sun and the Imperial Ring in their possession. They already knew they could steal their ring if they launched a big enough attack on them, but that took a great deal of time and effort. Well, the presence of Princess on the battlefield would probably make an all-out assault a little easier this time around, but it would still be a major undertaking that would consume a lot of their time and resources that would be better spent elsewhere. It's a pity Princess is too big to fit in the Ziggurat corridors, lamented Zack. Otherwise we could just climb on top of her and charge in, trampling and brushing aside any Sol Rotham that got in our way. If our attack was that unstoppable, the Sol Rotham would probably just pick up whatever they can and flee, pointed out Zorian. They'd probably flee underground and it would be an utter pain to track them down then. Not to mention they have a massive sandworm on their side. We don't want to get in an underground battle with them, I think, even with Princess on our side. Humph, Zack mumbled unhappily. How about we just infiltrate the Ziggurat through this underground connection then? We might be able to avoid a massive battle that way. They have their pet sandworm constantly guarding that, Zorian pointed out, shaking his head sadly. I bet we're noticed instantly through whatever exotic senses that thing has, and then it collapses the whole tunnel on top of us before we can do anything. Considering the layout of their dungeon entrance, I think it was made by the worm in the first place, so they probably have no qualms about destroying it. They can always command the sandworm to create another one later. Zack was silent for a while. How about just soul-killing the entire colony? Zack finally asked. I mean, it makes me a little uncomfortable to use tactics like that, but this is pretty much what the damn knife was made for. It's definitely an option, Zorian said after a short pause. However, we probably wouldn't be able to get all Sol Rotham with this, and we don't know how many of them know about the ring and its importance. If we kill most of the colony but one of the survivors takes the ring and runs, things could get really bad. Right now we know where the ring is. If a shattered group of Sol Rotham survivors takes the ring and spends a day or two running around in the desert or, gods forbid, the depths of the dungeon. Yeah, you're right, Zack said. It's too risky. Even if we get them all, there are neighboring Sol Rotham tribes and other denizens of the desert to consider. If they discover the state of the Ziggurat and loot the ring before we reach it, we would still have a problem on our hands. Speaking of the neighboring Sol Rotham tribes, do we still go forward with the idea of arranging an alliance with them? Zorian asked. The idea is nice, I admit, but it may very well take more time and effort to do it that way than to just send our own army at the Ziggurat. Not if we use Princess, Zack declared triumphantly. You want to use the damn Hydra for everything these days, Zorian scoffed. You're like a little kid who just got himself a new toy and now wants to show it to everyone. How the hell will that thing help us convince the Sol Rotham faster? There is no need to be jealous, Zorian, Zack chided. You lost the bet fair and square. In any case, I think you greatly underestimate the impression of power we will project when we show up with a giant menacing Hydra in tow. I bet those tribes will be tripping over themselves to stay on our good side after seeing that. Or they'll be too scared to even talk to us, Zorian pointed out. Then we just smash them until they're willing to listen, Zack shrugged. This is starting to sound a lot less like arranging an alliance and a lot more like us bullying the neighboring tribes into being our reluctant army, Zorian pointed out. I think of it more as an aggressive demonstration than bullying, Zack said dismissively. We would have had to prove our strength for them to take us seriously anyway. But really, so what if we end up cowing them into submission forcefully? We're already attacking the Ziggurat tribe without any provocation. We lost the moral high ground a long time ago, I think. True. All right, said Zorian. Let's try to make them willing allies if possible though. I have another task I want to give them, and they probably won't try very hard if our overwhelming force is all that keeps them in line. Oh. Something important. Zack asked. Maybe, Zorian answered. There is a magical creature called a tumbler toad which lives deep within the Zlotic desert. They live in a series of hidden worlds left by some forgotten ancient civilization, called Ishmali reservoirs by the ancient Icosians, because they seem designed primarily as water reservoirs. They're basically large caverns full of water, enclosed in their own pocket dimensions. The reservoirs are largely uninteresting, but the tumbler toads themselves have a curious ability to detect pocket dimensions and enter them with ease. In their natural habitat, they use this to pass in and out of the Ishmali reservoirs as they please, using them as a hidden nesting ground, but the ability is said to be usable on any pocket dimension they come across. Ah, I see, this is for that blood magic initiative you want to set up, Zack said. Why do you need the Solrotham's help for this, though? If the toads live only around these reservoir things, they should be easy to find. It's not like the reservoirs can move, right? They're static, but I'm afraid the records of where the reservoirs are located have all been lost in the cataclysm, and no one had bothered to track them down again as far as I can tell, Zorian said, shaking his head. With much of the interior now covered in desert and taken over by Solrotham tribes and worse, the reservoirs have become extremely isolated. Not to mention that most people are neither master dimensionalists nor tumbler toads, so they would be unable to track down and enter these hidden worlds even if they wanted to. Thus, if we want to find tumbler toads, we must find a desert native that has heard about strange toads that sometimes seemingly vanish into thin air, only to just as suddenly reappear later. Annoying, Zack remarked with a frown. Is this really necessary? We have lots of candidates for ability theft when it comes to magical creatures with relevant abilities. None of them are easy to track down, Zorian pointed out. Not only are they rare and mostly extinct near human-dominated territories, the very nature of their abilities means these creatures can hide and retreat with incredible ease. The other may very well be even more annoying to find. If you think tumbler toads are bad, wait till you hear how annoying it is to track down a phase spider without it taking the initiative to reveal itself. Right? Zack said, clacking his tongue unhappily. I guess I'll try to be a little nicer to the stupid wasps. He paused for a second. So we're really going to start dabbling in blood magic and enhancement rituals in this restart, then? Yes. Although we should start with something relatively easy and well-tested, Zorian confirmed. Eagle Eyes enhancement, for instance. Or any of the simple physical enhancements that aim to improve the user's strength, stamina, regeneration, and so on. Well-known, straightforward things that are unlikely to go catastrophically wrong when attempted by beginners like us. Not really instilling me with a sense of confidence here, Zorian, Zack complained. What can I say? Zorian shrugged. Blood magic is dangerous. If it makes you feel any better, I will be going first. It does not, Zack said. We both know it will be me who has to take the biggest risks in regards to this. I have way more mana to burn on permanent enhancements, and I am also proficient in medical magic, so I will be able to push my limits more and understand life force manipulation way better than you. Zorian didn't dispute him. While he had no intention of piling most of the risk on Zack, his fellow time traveler was likely right in his prediction. Don't make such a grim face, Zack said dismissively. I already agreed we should do this when we talked before, didn't I? I didn't change my mind. I kind of feel I'm pressuring you over this, Zorian admitted. I'm not that easy to pressure, Zack assured him. You've been trying to pressure me to let you inspect my mind for a long time now, for instance, and I have never let you do it. I still think that's a mistake, Zorian told him. And the answer is still no, Zack said, grinning. See? Pressure ineffective. I agreed with this creepy blood magic stuff because I honestly think you're right. We're too slow at figuring out primordial prisons. Only distasteful, unconventional methods like this can let us find a shortcut we need. Fair enough, Zorian said. Personally, he did not find blood magic to be that creepy, and even viewed it as a potentially useful tool for usage outside the time loop, but he understood where Zack was coming from. They spent 2 more hours discussing various ideas before they both entered the pocket dimension inside the Imperial Orb for a very important task. They had to convince Princess to let Zorian examine how her mind worked without trying to bite his head off for his insolence. It would prove to be a very challenging task. Break. As days went by, some curious things began to be noticed by various countries of Koth, Zlotic and Altazia. The first one was that House Terramachula suddenly organized and launched a major expedition to Blantyre in order to find the fabled imperial staff of Icosia, sinking a massive amount of money and manpower into the endeavor. The level of support House Terramachula had given to the project was not as extensive as Daimen had hoped, but it was still major by virtually any means, and the frantic speed with which the whole thing was organized and executed was enough to give others pause. The Terramachula seemed almost desperate to track down the staff, and nobody could figure out why. The leadership of the house declined to answer any questions regarding the matter, contributing to the air of mystery. More importantly, the Terramachula displayed the ability to open cross-continental dimensional passages between their land and their base in Blantyre. This was not something Zack and Zorian wanted to make known, but proved to be utterly impossible to hide, given the scale of the operation. This information soon spread around like a wildfire throughout various spy agencies, especially ones based in Koth, who were immediately consumed by an intense desire to know everything possible about the situation. Amusingly, this included trying to track down information about the Imperial staff. They thought the Imperial artifacts were just historical curiosities, but since the Terramachula wanted the staff so badly, there had to be something special about it. Many people suddenly wanted to get their hands on the Imperial staff, or at least hoped to understand what sort of power their rivals would possess should they successfully claim the item. Zack and Zorian intended to steal the results of all such research near the end of the restart. Who knows, maybe the combined might of all these spy agencies would find something they had overlooked. The second thing that got people's attention, especially in Altazia, was intricate spell formula schematics, alchemical recipes, new spell compendiums and sensitive spy reports that started to surface all over the continent. Nobody knew who was responsible for this, how they had come up with all this in complete secrecy, or what their motives were, and it was completely unknown just how many people had received this assistance, considering many people had simply accepted their gifts quietly and set out to exploit them in secret. Finally, the gifts seemed to be most heavily concentrated in Eldamar, which was a huge concern for everyone around them. This caused a frenzy of speculation and activity across the continent, as people tried to figure out what this meant and how to hopefully take advantage of it. This was of course done by Zack and Zorian. They did it for a very simple reason: to muddy the waters and prevent their newly marked fellow time travelers from standing out too much. It was too much to expect all of them to behave themselves at all times or never make a blunder, especially in this first restart while they were still under heavy impression of their first repeat of the month. Introducing enough waves into their surroundings would hopefully keep most people too busy with other matters to pay attention to crazy stories of time-traveling academy professors and the like. Thus far the idea seemed to be working, but it would remain to be seen if that would hold out until the end. This done, Zack and Zorian turned their attention to organizing the search for the Imperial staff in Blantyre. While the bulk of the job was done by Daimen and his men, it was a necessity for Zack and Zorian to get regularly involved. For one thing, the descriptions of the Imperial staff were vague and contradictory, so they were the only ones that could identify the staff with any degree of certainty, thanks to their ability to sense the presence of the key. Additionally, they were necessary for transporting people and supplies all over Blantyre, since they were the only ones that could easily open dimensional gates from one location to another. Zorian had been quietly hoping that the immense amount of resources they had mobilized in the search would provide quick results, but his hopes were soon dashed upon the rocks of reality. Finding the staff turned out to be much harder than finding a Bakura gate. The gates were rare and obscure but fairly distinctive. The staff, on the other hand, was something incredibly common in Blantyre. The lizard men loved their staves. They were a popular symbol of authority, and virtually any lizard man ruler and priest had a staff to call their own. While this meant that the Imperial staff probably hadn't been thrown away and forgotten in some ancient treasury, it also meant that tracking it down was akin to searching for a needle in a haystack. The one saving grace was that the Imperial staff was free of most decorations, being just a plain piece of dark wood, whereas the lizardmen liked to decorate their own staves with gems and feathers and whatnot. Then again, what was to stop the new owner from adding those things to the Imperial staff to pretty it up? Influenced by such things, Zack and Zorian decided to approach Quetzalcoatl for lessons again. Originally they wondered if they should skip their interaction with him in this particular restart, due to all the new time loopers suddenly walking around, but in the end they decided they would risk it. This time the topic they chose was tracking magic and search spells. This was a relatively safe topic to ask about, and it might help them find the staff faster. A foolish hope, probably, considering the staff was immune to normal divination, just like all the other Imperial artifacts. However, Quatakikal was familiar with divine energies in a way that others couldn't match, so perhaps he knew of a way it could be done. The topic was also potentially useful in tracking down Red Robe once they were outside the time loop, and it might give them an answer about how Quatakikal had managed to detect their presence at the end of the previous restart. Zorian really wanted an answer to that last question, since he had thought his privacy wards were pretty much flawless at this point. It was really unfortunate that he had been unable to find out anything of worth when he broke through Quatakikal's mental defenses, Zorian thought gloomily. While he was extremely proficient at performing memory probes by now, that type of magic took a long time to really get going, and the ancient lich had given him very little time to work with before abandoning his body. He probably shouldn't have tried to find out where Quatakikal's phylactery was located. That kind of information was incredibly important and was thus bound to be guarded with the greatest possible zeal. He should have gone for something fairly mundane. Maybe Quatakikal would have been willing to risk things and spend more time struggling against his mental probe. At the moment, though, Zack and Zorian were in the time magic research facility beneath Cyoria. The two of them were disguised as adult agents of the Crown, and were having a private talk with Cranton Keklos, the head researcher and overseer of the facility. Cranton was slowly turning the Imperial orb in his hands, utterly fascinated with it. "You understand that we require your complete silence about this matter, don't you, Mr. Keklos?" Zorian asked him. The man suddenly looked up, a slightly confused look on his face. He had evidently been so absorbed in his study of the orb that he had lost track of time. "Oh yes, I absolutely understand the need for secrecy," Cranton quickly said, nodding furiously. "I assure you, me and my team are quite used to working on top-secret projects and dealing with potential leaks." He took another long look at the orb in his hands. "This thing, it's absolutely amazing," he said, obvious admiration in his voice. "I cannot put into words how glad I am to be given this honor. I hope you remember you are not being given this orb just to satisfy your personal curiosity," Zack said gruffly. He was playing the bad guy in their fake royal agent scheme. "We have given you this honor because you are our nation's foremost expert on black rooms, and we hope you can turn this pocket dimension into the largest one yet. Can you do it or not?" "Yes, absolutely," Cranton said. "While the volume of space inside is larger than anything we have ever done, the isolation from the outside world is also unprecedented. We can definitely turn this into a temporal dilation zone." Just. Zorian prompted. "Double, this is a very ambitious undertaking you are proposing here," Cranton said, stumbling over the words slightly. Zorian could feel that, although Cranton was a little nervous, he was also determined to make the absolute most out of this opportunity he was presented with. "To create this thing you are proposing, we would have to considerably expand the research facility and design whole new methods of blackroom construction. While I am sure we can do it eventually, the amount of time involved is not small. We are a very small team and—" "You want more money," Zack said bluntly, cutting him off. "And people," Cranton nodded. He seemed to sense this was important to them. In that case, he felt it was entirely appropriate to ask for increased commitment in terms of resources and available staff. Zorian did not answer verbally. He just reached into his jacket and handed Cranton a promissory note from one of the local banks. He could have brought actual cash too, of course, but he knew by now that government facilities like this rarely dealt with such things, and that dumping large stacks of paper money on them would be a huge mistake. It would raise all sorts of red flags in their heads. Cranton wordlessly accepted the promissory note and glanced at it. He raised his eyebrow at the number printed on it. Zorian could tell he was appreciative but not really impressed. "This is just the initial sum to get you started, of course," Zorian said. "You will get further funding once things actually start moving forward, as well as additional bonuses if the project is going particularly well." "Of course," Cranton said, slightly more impressed. "In regards to additional staff, that is a bit more complex," Zorian said. "Due to the somewhat abrupt nature of this initiative, it will take at least a month before we can send some new people here on a permanent basis." "That's fine," Cranton said easily. "I can wait a month or several. Just be aware that the longer it takes for additional manpower to arrive, the more the project will stall." "I wasn't finished," Zorian said, shaking his head. Although we cannot send people here officially, you will get several mages skilled in dimensionalism to help you move faster with the project. Specifically, the man would be getting Svim, Silverlake, Zack and Zorian. With their expertise in dimensionalism and with the research facility staff's experience in constructing black rooms, the project would hopefully result in something useful after a few restarts. Cranton didn't seem to like the idea, however. I don't like experts outside my authority coming here telling me how to run things, he told them bluntly. Even if they're highly capable, they don't know the wider context of why we do things the way we do. They would just slow things down and create confusion. Are you the facility overseer or not? Zack challenged. Are you telling me that you cannot keep a couple of new arrivals in line or bring them up to speed in a timely manner? Cranton frowned at him, giving him a slightly angry look. These people are being sent here as help, Zorian said in a conciliatory tone. If, after talking to them, you feel they contribute nothing of worth to the project, you are free to send them away. Just remember that their help has already been factored into our projections on how long the project will take, Zack warned. Very well, Cranton said a little unhappily. I shall give these people a chance at least. We will see if they are as good as you say they are. It took them another hour to arrange everything. Zack and Zorian handed Cranton a whole stack of official documentation, which the man merely glanced at before handing it over to the rest of his staff. He evidently didn't even consider the idea that this was all just an elaborate ruse. Zorian hoped the people actually in charge of processing the documentation would be every bit as careless as their overseer, because many of the documents wouldn't stand up to detailed scrutiny. Well, Cranton eventually breathed out. This has certainly been a productive evening. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about? Actually, yes, Zorian nodded, handing the man another folder full of documents. There's been a change in regards to the group that is planned to take advantage of the next Black Room period. This wasn't how Zack and Zorian usually took over the Black Room beneath Cyoria when they wanted to use it. Normally they just disabled the true group and then showed up with bogus documents at the last possible moment, giving the facility staff little time to consider the issue. This time, however, they planned to bring an entire group with them. Thus, they had taken time to arrange things a little more thoroughly. Oh. The Retons group decided to cancel their scheduled Black Room use. Cranton said, skimming through the folder. Strange, they were all so enthusiastic about the whole thing. He gave them a knowing look. He clearly knew there was some foul play involved here, but he probably thought it was the government bullying a group into dropping their claim rather than some kind of deception. He shook his head sadly, throwing the folder to the side. I'm curious, he said. This orb, the sudden changes in resource allocations and the like, are they related to these mysterious gifts I keep hearing about through the rumor mill? We aren't paid to ask those kind of questions and neither are you, Zack told him grimly. But probably, added Zorian. Zack gave him a warning look in response. He was a pretty good actor, all things considered. Did he used to do this sort of thing a lot during past restarts, or was he just a natural? Alright, I understand. Forget I asked, Cranton said, rising from his seat. I guess we should both get back to our jobs. When can I expect these experts of yours? 3 days from now, Zorian said. That should be enough to see if their ruse worked or not. We will also periodically drop by to check your progress and see if you need anything. Give me sufficient resources and I'll give you what you want, Cranton assured them. Zorian had no doubt about that. The real question was whether the results would come fast enough to be of any use. He also swore mentally that if Cranton really produced impressive results with what they've given him, he would find a way to reward him for it in the real world. Somehow. In a typical restart, Zack and Zorian had a habit of holding meetings in all sorts of different places. Parks, taverns, abandoned houses, houses under construction, tiny caves in the middle of the wilderness. They usually made a choice based on pure impulse and convenience. The novelty of holding a meeting in a new location was also a welcome reprieve from the soul-crushing sameness that dominated the time loop. Now, however, they had a lot more people participating in these kinds of meetings. This completely changed their usual dynamic. They couldn't decide these kinds of things on a whim anymore. They now had to find a space big enough to hold all of them in relative comfort and make sure everyone could gather there in a timely manner. Public places were pretty much out of consideration. A group of a dozen people of a variety of ages and occupations, plus some giant spiders, would turn heads wherever they went. Additionally, Ilsa got angry at them when they tried to arrange for a meeting in a cold, damp cave in the middle of uninhabited wilderness. Zorian didn't understand what the big deal was. The centipede that tried to climb up her leg was less than a finger thick and the bats didn't bother anyone. But afterwards everyone agreed to only hold meetings in actual buildings. Thus, the two of them eventually decided to just hold all the meetings at the Novita estate. The place had plenty of empty, spacious rooms and very good privacy wards already in place. Though Zack complained that was the boring choice, he agreed with Zorian that organizing meetings elsewhere was more trouble than it was worth. Thus, at this moment, there was a huge group of people gathered in one of the larger meeting rooms in the Novita estate. The actual meeting was already over by this point, but the group had not disbanded for the day. Instead, they had mostly broken up into smaller groups that discussed things of mutual interest between themselves. In one corner, the emissary from the Filigree Sages was having a loud and enthusiastic discussion with Nora Bull. The female spell formula teacher did not seem to mind that she was talking to a giant spider and instead relished the chance to discuss her field of study with a kindred soul. The Filigree Sage's emissary, meanwhile, seemed immensely pleased to have found a human mage that was interested in their brand of spell formula. The two of them seemed completely oblivious to their surroundings and the passage of time, so consumed they were in their discussion. Not far from them, Alanik and Kieran had covered a table full of various maps and were staring at it in silence. Every once in a while they would point at a random spot on the map and speak a few curt words at each other before falling silent again. Zorian couldn't figure out anything from their brief, mysterious exchanges. In all likelihood, neither could anyone else. Everyone seemed to be giving them a wide berth. In the other corner, Zack was having a loud discussion with the emissary from the Luminous Advocates. This one was less friendly than the one between Nora Bull and the Filigree Sage's emissary, though. Zack seemed to be trying to convince the Luminous Advocates to tutor him in mind magic, while the emissary was stubbornly pointing out that Zack wasn't psychic and that this would be a waste of time. Zorian suspected Zack would get his way in the end. Luminous Advocates were a lot less prideful with them after experiencing the time loop in person, and they now knew exactly how powerful Zack was. They knew they couldn't afford to piss him off, and Zack was unlikely to quit once he set his mind on something, so they would probably cave in eventually. Whether anything would come out of such a lesson was something Zorian was a lot less sure about. Not too far from them, a small group consisting of Kale, Taven, Lukav and Daimen was sorting through the various rare materials Zack and Zorian gathered and exchanging stories. The talk seemed to be pretty mundane, focusing on amusing anecdotes and such. One of the tables was completely monopolized by Silver Lake, poring over their documents related to their study of the Abasin Gate. Zorian was pretty surprised at her behavior in this restart, in all honesty. She seemed far more enthusiastic and open about helping them now. It was interesting how dramatically she changed once she experienced the time loop with her own eyes. Finally, there was Zorian. Like Silver Lake, he wasn't really interacting with anyone at the moment. Instead, he was inspecting a table full of divine artifacts that they had stolen for study. He had never made any progress in figuring out these things, but he certainly wasn't about to give up. Especially since Quatakikal had given them definite confirmation that it was possible to at least detect divine energies with regular magic. Eventually his solitude was broken by Svim, who walked up to his table and sat down on the chair next to him. He looked faintly displeased. "Problems?" Zorian asked. "I have a newfound appreciation for the amount of patience you and Mr. Novita possess," he said blandly. "I've just spent the entire morning marking down a stack of student homework that was absolutely identical to what I had already done in the previous restart and realized this would happen a lot. An unpleasant realization." "Ha," Zorian said. "You can always just ignore it." Svim shook his head. "That would go against my professional pride," he said. "Just as I demand dedication from my students, I demand the same from myself. A little thing like this should not break me. I shall treat it as personal tempering, I suppose." "I see," Zorian said, nodding. "I suppose you'd be quite a hypocrite if, after subjecting your students to such an infuriating initial treatment, you ended up losing your patience after only a handful of repeating months." Svim hummed in response, not giving a verbal response. He glanced at the divine artifacts Zorian was inspecting. "You realize, I'm sure, that no one has ever managed to figure out how divine artifacts actually work?" Svim asked. "Of course," Zorian said. "But very few people had the opportunity to take one apart over and over again as a method of study." Still, I'm surprised you're wasting time on this, Svim remarked. Wouldn't it be wiser to spend more time on time loop-related things? I would actually classify this as very much a time loop-related thing, Zorian answered. The time loop clearly works at least partially with the help of divine energies. Who's to say they aren't involved with our markers? Oh, Svim asked, suddenly more interested. It's just baseless speculation, Zorian said. But I've been thinking about what Red Robe could possibly have that other past controllers didn't, that would allow him to break the limitations placed on temporary markers, and the most likely answer I've come up with is, I suspect divine energies are involved with the marker somehow, and that the reason Red Robe had been able to alter it is because he had Quatakikle's help. His method of perceiving and possibly modifying divine energies may have allowed him to tamper with the marker in ways that are impossible to us, in which case our efforts to understand and modify the marker are doomed to fail right from the very start. I hope you are not right about that, Svim said after a short pause. Quatakikle has been alive for centuries. Who knows how long it took him to develop such capabilities? Zorian had nothing to say to that.